MI6 warns Putin is dragging peace talks. The chokepoint that could decide the outcome. A public warning from Britain's foreign intelligence chief has landed in the middle of a fragile diplomatic push to end the war in Ukraine. On December 15th, the head of MI6, Blaise Metreweli, said Russia's president is prolonging negotiations while the war grinds on. Her message was not just about battlefield violence. It was about time as a weapon, talks that stretch, terms that shift, and pressure that moves from the front line into budgets, politics, and public patience. The unresolved question is not whether peace is desirable. It is what kind of peace is enforceable, and who pays if it fails. The story turns on whether an enforceable security guarantee can be agreed before the facts on the ground harden. Key points. MI6 Chief Blaise Metreweli has publicly warned that Vladimir Putin is prolonging negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, while Russia continues to prosecute the conflict. The key bottleneck is enforcement. Any ceasefire or deal is only as real as the mechanism that verifies it and punishes violations. The longer talks drag, the more leverage shifts toward whoever can absorb time's costs, militarily, economically, and politically. A second-order risk sits outside Ukraine, below the threshold attacks. Disruption in Europe can intensify, even if headline diplomacy continues. Confirmed, Metreweli made the warning in a public speech on December 15th. Unknown whether Russia will accept terms that limit its freedom of action. Disputed, unclear, the final shape and sequencing of any proposed peace package now being discussed. Watch for signals that negotiations are moving from messaging to mechanics, monitoring, timelines, sanction sequencing, and clear penalties for breach. Background. MI6 is the UK's Foreign Intelligence Service. Its chief is one of the few publicly identifiable figures in British intelligence, and public remarks are typically calibrated to shape deterrence and signal resolve without exposing sources or methods. Metreweli's December 15th speech focused heavily on Russia. She described a Russia that wants to subjugate Ukraine and pressure NATO, while using a mix of military force and gray zone tactics, cyber, sabotage, and influence operations designed to create disruption without triggering a full military response. Her intervention came as diplomacy around Ukraine remains active but unsettled. Multiple parties are discussing frameworks that could halt fighting, but the hard questions, territory, security guarantees, and sanctions remain structurally difficult to reconcile. Analysis, political, and geopolitical dimensions. Putin's core incentive in talks is leverage. If Russia believes it can improve its position through continued fighting, or through continued pressure short of open escalation, then a slow negotiation track can be rational without requiring any hidden motive. Ukraine's core incentive is survival with sovereignty intact. That means avoiding a pause that simply resets Russia for a later attack, while also managing war fatigue and the limits of manpower and munitions. Western governments sit between those incentives. They want an end to a war that strains budgets and attention, but they also need a settlement that does not invite repetition. For leaders, the constraint is not only military, it is political. Voters, parliaments, and competing domestic priorities. Scenarios and triggers. Manage ceasefire with teeth becomes more likely if a monitoring and enforcement plan is published and backed with credible consequences for violations. Talks as theater becomes more likely if timelines slip, red lines remain maximal, and process replaces concrete mechanisms. Escalation to improve bargaining position becomes more likely if either side launches a major offensive or expands strike intensity while still claiming to negotiate. Economic and market impact. Dragging talks changes the economic balance, even if borders do not move. Time increases the cumulative cost of replacing destroyed equipment, supporting displaced populations, and maintaining aid. For Europe, prolonged uncertainty keeps energy and insurance risk elevated, complicates investment decisions, and increases pressure for higher defense spending over multiple budget cycles. For Russia, the constraint is the durability of its war economy under sanctions and the social cost of sustaining a long conflict. Second-order effects show up quietly: shipping risk premiums, cyber risk costs for critical infrastructure, and supply chain decisions that treat instability as the new normal. Scenarios and triggers. Aid lock-in becomes more likely if multi-year funding packages pass with wide political support. Aid volatility becomes more likely if elections, fiscal stress, or coalition splits begin delaying or shrinking commitments. Technological and security implications. Metreweli's warning sits alongside a broader point. The conflict does not stay on the battlefield. Gray zone pressure can rise, even when diplomacy is alive. That matters because gray zone tactics exploit legal and political hesitation. Attribution takes time. Responses are often slower than the disruption. If negotiations drag, this pressure can be used to weaken unity and raise the perceived cost of supporting Ukraine. This is also where speed matters. Drones, cyber tools, and influence operations can shift effects in days, while diplomacy moves in weeks. Scenarios and triggers. Rising gray zone tempo becomes more likely if there is a visible uptick in sabotage, cyber incidents, or infrastructure disruption across Europe. Containment becomes more likely if governments coordinate rapid attribution, public warning, and consistent penalties. Social and cultural fallout. Long negotiations test public attention spans. War becomes background noise, but the bills do not. That creates a predictable tension. Sympathy remains, but tolerance for open-ended costs can erode. In Ukraine, the social constraint is exhaustion under continual threat. In Europe and the US, the constraint is narrative drift. Other crises compete. Support becomes a domestic argument rather than a shared strategic posture. This is where time works in both directions. If Ukraine's partners stay steady, time can strengthen deterrence. If unity frays, time becomes a pressure tool. What most coverage misses? The overlooked bottleneck is not a slogan like peace or victory. It is enforcement design. A ceasefire without verification is a rumor. A deal without penalties is a bet. The hardest part is building a structure where violations are quickly detected and reliably punished, without creating loopholes that allow incremental grabs and plausible deniability. That is why dragging talks matters. It is not just delay. It is a contest over whether the end state is governed by rules or by momentum. Why this matters? In the short term, prolonged talks keep uncertainty high. For civilians under fire, for governments funding the war, and for businesses pricing risk. In the long term, the outcome sets a precedent for European security. If a settlement looks reversible, deterrence weakens. If it looks enforceable, it can harden stability, even without trust. Concrete things to watch next. Whether negotiators publish a clear sequencing plan, ceasefire terms, monitoring, prisoner exchanges, sanctions relief, if any, and the order those steps happen. Whether Russia accepts any framework that limits future freedom of action, rather than only freezing current lines. Whether European and U.S. political support stays synchronized into early 2026. Whether gray zone incidents increase while diplomacy continues. If you remember one thing, a peace deal is only real if the enforcement mechanism is real. Real-world impact. A logistics manager in eastern Poland reroutes shipments and builds extra buffer stock because cross-border disruption feels more likely than last year. Costs rise quietly, then hit consumers later. A small manufacturer in northern Italy delays a machinery upgrade because insurance and energy volatility make forecasts unreliable. Hiring plans slow, even though orders exist. A cybersecurity lead for a UK regional airport increases spend on monitoring. And incident response after a cluster of nuisance disruptions across Europe. The disruption is brief. The cost is permanent. A family in central Ukraine hears talks are progressing again, but keeps children out of school on days when air alerts spike. Daily life stays on wartime rules until something verifiable changes. Road ahead. MI6's warning is a reminder that negotiations are not a parallel track to the war. They are part of it. If talks drag without enforceable mechanics, time favors the side that can absorb cost and exploit ambiguity. If talks produce verification, timelines, and penalties, time can start to favor stability. You will know which way it is breaking when announcements shift from broad intent to hard design, who monitors, what triggers a violation, and what happens the next day if the deal is broken.